All right, good evening, everyone. Welcome. Welcome to the Atlanta Council. Thank you for coming out tonight. Happy Pride. Delighted to have you here at the Atlanta Council. My name is Damon Wilson. I'm the Executive Vice President here, and I'm delighted to welcome you all to what I hope will be a very engaging discussion on the importance of diversity in the national security area. We're going to be using the hashtag Pride Month tonight and tweeting, covering this live on our social media channels, on our AC Global Diversity Twitter account. So please join the conversation if you're following online as well. Thank you for being with us. Before I kick off the discussion and introduce Secretary Fanning, let me just give a shout out to our partners this evening, to Luke, Sean, and Rusty from Alton National Security. Thank you for partnering with us on this important event, and thank you for your leadership in cultivating such an important community. I also want to thank the Atlanta Council's LGBTI Advisory Council members. I'm proud to say that the Atlanta Council has an LGBT Advisory Council. We're here with Walt Slocum on our board, who's helped to anchor that. And all the other members who are in attendance. Really pleased to welcome Ambassador Ted Osius. Thank you for being with us as well. It's terrific. He's a former U.S. ambassador to Vietnam, who's in town from Singapore. Yes. Everybody in this room knows that diversity is one of America's greatest strengths. And the next generation of leaders that are set to take the reins of power is the most diverse yet. We see that all around us. And I think in many respects, we recognize that our own competitiveness mandates that we embrace this diversity, investing in policies to recruit, retain, and develop the best and brightest from all segments of our population. But for many of us results-oriented people here, results have been too slow to materialize. I think it's especially true in our community across the national security and foreign policy enterprise, which has long been one of the least diverse and perhaps in some respects sometimes hostile to that growing diversity. So while there's been much progress in recognizing diversity as a strategic asset and acknowledging the need for a diverse labor force to respond to the challenges of that are defining the 21st century, the numbers haven't changed as much as you would expect. And I think this is particularly true for lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and intersex Americans serving our country. LGBTI Americans have always served. They've always fought our wars, led our diplomatic efforts, and steered our foreign policy. However, be it under the asphyxiation of Don't Ask, Don't Tell, or any number of anti-LGBTI pieces of legislation, they were forced to hide their authentic selves for too long. That's really over. And that's part of what this initiative is about, giving profile to the issues, about mainstreaming LGBTI issues in a foreign policy discourse, about profiling the practitioners who are experts in the national security foreign policy field, and helping to provide ideas around strategies for our country and our allies on these issues. So as part of the Atlanta Council's commitment to constructive leadership in international affairs, we feel it's very important to elevate the voices of LGBTI Americans dedicated to the security of our nation. At a time when the rights of LGBTI Americans remain under threat, and every step forward seems to sometimes be accompanied with a step back, we've joined forces with our friends at Alton National Security to profile 25 next-generation LGBTI foreign policy and national security leaders, many of whom are with us tonight. Welcome. Can I ask that those who are part of that group, could you please stand just for us, please? Please stand. Thank you. Thank you. We're going to be championing you, featuring you on our websites, our social media accounts, and really are invested in the success of your trajectory and your careers. And I want to thank my colleague Vicente Garcia for helping to manage and run all this on our part as well. You'll find a printout of the full list. I think we've got it around here. We've got it outside. We also have it on our website. And I hope you're able to engage these leaders as we all work to increase diversity and inclusion in national security and foreign policy space. To that end, I'm also pleased, before we get the program started, to announce another initiative the Atlanta Council is launching, which will be a longer-term non-residential fellowship for rising LGBTI leaders under the age of 35. This follows a process that we undertake here where we are committed to fostering the next generation of global leaders. We designed these fellowships around a series of master classes and private roundtable discussions here in Washington to help folks learn firsthand how to navigate and succeed in their careers. how to meet the folks that will actually help empower in, their career over time, and to gain the kind of expertise from experts and officials who are currently working on many of the same challenges that we're trying to tackle in the 21st century, to make a commitment to give oxygen, to invest in the LGBTI national security foreign policy leaders of tomorrow by tapping those that are here with us today and in our program. We've been able to have many of the out U.S. ambassadors who have served and other officials sort of commit to this process. Former Secretary of Defense Chuck Hagel, our former chairman, has offered also to help meet and steward the program as well. We want the fellowship to be a leadership pipeline, a leadership accelerator, if you will, for the next ambassadors, the next top government officials, the next CEOs, NGO leaders, and journalists in the foreign policy community that needs more diverse but talented voices. This is also going to be up on our website. I think it's gone up today, where you can apply. Please share that with colleagues, spread that in the community. We're looking to invest in this group. So with that, let me turn to our program. I want to turn things over. I'm going to invite shortly to the stage the former U.S. Secretary of the Army, Eric Fanning, who among many other accomplishments has done yeoman's work throughout his career to advance LGBTI inclusion in our armed forces. Eric Fanning is President and Chief Executive Officer of the Aerospace and Industries Association. It's a leading advocacy organization for the aerospace and defense industry. And in this role, he plays a really important part in how the private sector works to keep our country strong, bolster our capacity to innovate and spur economic growth. I think most of you know that he joined AIA after serving as the 22nd Secretary of the Army, where he provided leadership and oversight of our largest military service. But he previously served as Chief of Staff of the Secretary of Defense, Acting Secretary of the Air Force, and Undersecretary of the Air Force, and Deputy Undersecretary of the Navy, Deputy Chief Management Officer. He is kind of remarkable scope there. He's the only person to have held senior appointments in all three military departments and the Office of the Secretary of Defense. During his career, he's had a chance to work up on Congress, the House Armed Services Committee, was Senior Vice President for Business Executives for National Security, a Deputy Director of the Commission on the Prevention of Weapons of Mass Destruction and Proliferation and Terrorism, and an Associate Director of Political Affairs at the White House. Eric has been a leader in this field. We are delighted to have you here tonight to kick off this conversation. Thank you so much for giving us your time. Let me invite you to the podium. Thank you.
I always tell people the key to a successful career is to get in and out of the job before they realize the mistakes that you've made. So that's why I was able to do so many things during those 8 years. I agreed to do that this weekend, so I'm thinking through my thoughts even as I stand here based on how I've heard your day went. I'll start real quick just by talking about my current job, and then I want to talk about my experience in the Pentagon. One of the great things about this job is if you ask the CEOs of aerospace and defense firms, that's space, civil aviation, defense, what their biggest strategic concern is, it's going to be almost unanimously workforce issues. And it's been great to see what is a very traditional environment in many ways. A lot of the CEOs of these big firms have worked no place but the companies that they run, how seriously they take making sure that they are inclusive, because they know that they will not succeed as companies. And our industry as an American national treasure succeed unless they access the best and brightest the company has to offer. So that's been an interesting part of the job for me. We focus on things, getting kids as early as third grade interested in STEM, because nothing they do, they can do without people. I want to, though, talk about this through the lens of the Pentagon and my time in the Pentagon. And we're going to have a great panel after this talking about how we can get at some things. I'll talk a little bit about what we did and what the experience was like. And it's actually kind of counterintuitive in some ways to think about the Pentagon. Whenever we've tried to change something in my lifetime, people will come running out of the bushes screaming that we're dragging the Pentagon into social experimentation and undercutting good order and discipline and morale, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. My argument is the exact opposite. In many ways, the Pentagon is forced to confront things early because it's a life and death mission, and they can't allow things to fester and to cause problems. And it's not experimenting, it's fixing. Don't always get it right. Sometimes you got to drag them forward on things. But it's been an interesting process. I'm old enough now, or even then, to have gone through my first security clearance process when it was still grounds for refusing you a security clearance. I wasn't openly gay at the time, so I didn't have to lie to get my clearance, but it resonated with me when I went through that process. And I was in the Clinton Pentagon that very first day, because I worked for Les Aspin, who was the first Secretary of Defense. I worked for him on the House Armed Services Committee. So I was there as Don't Ask, Don't Tell was created. And it was an interesting experience. It seems like ancient history now. I thought I was the only gay person in the building, 25,000 people, and I thought I was it. We know that's not true. And over time, I've come to realize there were other people there with me. I wasn't out when we were having this debate, and I would sit with my boss and others, as a backbencher, when he was discussing this and debating this with the chiefs at the time. This is the early 90s. Chiefs didn't know there was anybody in the room who was gay. I'm not even sure they cared. And the way they talked about us in our community was a really staggering experience, to the point that after Don't Ask, Don't Tell was created, I did come out very warmly received by, at this point, Aspen's gone, Bill Perry's in, who's wonderful. John Deutsch was deputy secretary of my boss and very inclusive of me and my partner at the time. But again, I didn't think there was anybody else like me in that building, in that community, in that career field. And as a result, I left DC. I left politics, moved to New York, went to work in journalism for a little while. I ended up missing the substance and the policy, which is why I came back. But I just didn't think there was a path for me. People like me didn't succeed in national security. And so I, fast forward, return at the start of the Obama administration, and it was really strange to come back to a building that still discriminated institutionally. It still does. But Don't Ask, Don't Tell was still the law of the land. But you had a president who was campaigning to overturn it and was doing interesting things from the start in terms of building his team. President Obama would send slates back to presidential personnel because they weren't diverse. And he put it in a way that has really just stuck with me and is very interesting. He appreciated the value of diversity, but what he would tell the presidential personnel teams, the transition teams, that if you send me a slate that's not diverse, I think you just did a lazy search. Ducks pick ducks. And that stuck with me. When I became Secretary of the Army, we actually instituted the Rooney Rule in writing, in a directive, for slates for jobs that were career-making jobs, career-enhancing jobs. So all the executive assistants, you get a military assistant, he's a colonel, she's a colonel. Odds are, if it's the Secretary of the Army's military assistant, that person's going to become a general. And so to make sure that the teams weren't just picking people that they knew from previous deployments or assignments, we told them that the slate had to look diverse and be diverse, so they know that they were looking across the entire institution. But I go now back to the repeal of Don't Ask, Don't Tell, and some of you may remember that it was coming down to the START Treaty and Don't Ask, Don't Tell, and a lot of people were telling President Obama, you don't have the political capital to do both. But thank God he didn't believe them, and he went for both, and we got that down to the wire, because we were going to lose. We weren't going to have both chambers, and so it was going to be really hard, if not impossible, to overturn Don't Ask, Don't Tell after the first 2 years. And I thought, well, I can stay here while we're fighting to overturn it. I can't stay if it remains in existence, even though it didn't apply to me. And you probably all appreciate this. If you were here in Washington the day that was signed, lots of celebration going on. And I'm out that night with a lot of friends, and they're asking what it was like in the Pentagon, and it was like nothing in the Pentagon. We went back to our offices and talked about the budget, which is what you talk about in the Pentagon every single day. But it was illuminating to me too, because we'd spent so much time doing it that the Pentagon's reaction was sort of like, isn't this already done? Why are we still talking about this? And you may not remember, I was in the Navy Department at the time. The service that generally is the most resistant to these things is the Marine Corps, and they certainly were to the repeal of Don't Ask, Don't Tell. They were also the first service to have a video up on their website with the commandant and the senior enlisted saying, anybody who wears the uniform of a Marine is a Marine and deserves the respect of a Marine. And that was a lesson that I carried forward, because we did a number of things to continue to open up service, opening up all combat positions to women, of course the transgenderists, which I'll talk about in a second. Even in the Army, we extended religious accommodation to Sikhs. And that was the most dramatic debate, more so than transgender, more so than gays in the military, more so than women in combat. And it's an old sort of traditional notion that these leaders have about what a soldier should look like in a uniform. And this just strayed too far for them. And I came out of a very emotional meeting with a group of generals who were opposed to this change. It would undermine good order and discipline, which, by the way, any of you in the military, when you use that expression, this is what we hear you say. I don't have a real reason, so I'm going to say it undercuts good order and discipline. And I'm in my office with my military assistant, a colonel who'd just come out of major command, and I said, could you make this work? He goes, I could figure it out. And the next week, we were down at Fort Jackson, where the Army does a lot of basic training, and I'm talking to a young instructor down there about this issue, and he looks at me like I'm an idiot. And then he just points, and there's an 18-year-old Sikh in basic training, and they had figured out how to accommodate the Sikh in Fort Jackson, and said to me, no help from you, by the way, thank you, we've had to figure this out on our own. But this is the sort of the two lessons that I take from that and all of these experiences. One, 18-year-olds in the military come out of a different world than the 3-star, 4-star generals do. And that evolution is instructive to it won't work, I can figure it out, it's already happening. And two is just that these debates we have are framed in terms of who should be allowed to serve. And in truth, these people are already serving and have been. I mean, gays have been fighting in the military certainly since Alexander the Great. Women have been dying alongside men. We know we have transgender service members, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, Sikhs, at the time we were having this debate, the Minister of Defense of Canada was a Sikh who'd been a special forces soldier in the Canadian military. And so you realize it's just policy catching up with reality. And when Ash Carter said we're going to move forward on lifting the transgender ban, he said, for two reasons. We ought to respect someone's desire to serve, and we owe it to the commanders in the field to put some policy in place so they don't have to figure it out on their own. And one thing we did during that debate about transgender service, because remember, Don't Ask, Don't Tell was 20 years in the making, 20 years in the ending. It's 4 decades of personalizing this in stories and humanizing it. The transgender part, and the building was bracing for it. They're like, well, that's next. Moved a lot more quickly. And people hadn't had time to understand it or ask the questions. And so I'm sorry Brad Carson couldn't be here, because he's one of the true heroes of this. We organized breakfasts and lunches and meetings with transgender service members. Jen Pierce, who you were with earlier, was one of them, and the chiefs. Going back to what we learned from Don't Ask, Don't Tell, because the chiefs see a table filled with people wearing the uniform of the service for which they're responsible, and it changes the nature of the debate. And they're like, that's my soldier, don't mess with that person. This is all on the record. I've said it publicly before. I did it in the Air Force, and then when I moved to the Army, so I was moving during that debate. But Mark Milley was Chief of Staff of the Air Force Army, asking some very pointed questions of soldiers at this lunch who I think were happy to be asked and to be able to answer. And Jen told this heart-wrenching story that she can't comfortably use any bathroom in the headquarters where she was posted, that she had to leave the building, walk across the street to a construction site, and use the porta potty there. And Mark Milley didn't understand this issue at all. This was like January. He said the first time I knowingly met a transgender person was when the secretary invited them to our holiday open house, at his house, by the way. But he was so incensed that a soldier in his army had to go through with that we shared a wall and a door that was a thick, heavy skiff door, but I could hear him yelling through that door as he called the 2-star general at this base and said, I don't understand this issue. I don't know what we're going to do, but this woman is wearing the uniform of the United States Army, and she can't be treated that way. And so as we think through, I think I've gone way past the minutes allocated to me. As we think through in this next panel what it is that we can do, what things we could do, I would just say thank you to all of you, because that visibility is important. The diversity, and now we say diversity inclusion. To me, the inclusion part is them knowing we're there. and seeing that we already do the job. And that debate in the military, which is still evolving, has these chiefs and counterparts and their officers and enlisted looking at these communities that they didn't think should be able to serve and realizing they already are and they're doing a really good job. Let's move forward on the debate. I'm going to close just by sort of riffing off something Damon said, which is a little over 2 years ago when we were going through the transition. I'd get asked a lot what's going to happen, and I'd say progress is never linear. It's 2 steps forward and 1 step back. But as I thought about that more, I realized that those 2 steps forward and that 1 step back don't fall across our community proportionally. And at a time like this, with what's going on, I know you got a briefing today, we got to really think about the parts of our community and the larger ecosystem, because the more people that we bring forward that aren't LGBTQI, the better for all of us. But we really need to pay close attention to those people who suffer the brunt of that 1 step backward more than the rest of us. So with that, thank you very much for having me. Thanks for what you're doing, and I look forward to the panel.
Thank you, Eric. That was fantastic. Now we want to continue the conversation on strengthening national security and investing in LGBTI leaders. I'm going to invite Mira Patel to come to the stage. Mira is with us now from Facebook, but she's been involved with the council, been involved with our advisory council, and was a champion on LGBTI issues at the State Department. I'll let you introduce our fabulous panelists.
Thank you so much, Damon. Thank you all for being here. Happy Pride. Wonderful to see you. We know we stand between you and a reception, and I know what we're like. So we will make this as exciting as possible. I'll also say we'll do a panel for a brief period of time, but we really want to hear from all of you. I know it's been a big day, and many of the experiences and voices and expertise that you all bring to the table are what's going to make both the work that the Atlantic Council is doing most successful, and we have 2 founders of 2 newer organizations that are really attempting to tackle this in a comprehensive way. I was also am proud to have been an Atlantic Council Millennium Fellow. I was in the Obama administration and worked primarily with Secretary Clinton to build out our LGBT rights agenda, including founding the Global Equality Fund. And what I think was fascinating about that time was being able to see the experiences that LGBTI people brought to the table, whether they were political appointees or civil servants, and also what the allies brought to the table. And I think one thing to think about, building on Secretary Fanning's remarks, is really thinking about how we can all be allies to each other to strengthen this work. Because we've seen that it is a long-term game, but that through sustained work, initiatives like the Atlantic Council's LGBT Advisory Council is able to really push this body of work forward regardless of administration, because it is truly the best way forward around foreign policy and national security issues to be inclusive of LGBTI people amongst other kinds of diverse perspectives and experiences. So first, I'd love to bring to the stage Ambassador Bonnie Jenkins. She is the founder and executive director of Women of Color, Advancing Peace, Security, and Conflict Transformation, and is a non-resident fellow at the Brookings Institution. She was formerly the special envoy and coordinator for threat reduction programs at the Bureau of International Security and Nonproliferation at State. And there she managed all of the department's programs and activities related to preventing weapons of mass destruction and terrorism. And please, Ambassador. And then Sean Skelly is the co-founder of the Out in National Security organization, of which we have 20 fellows here in the room with us, right? Honorees. And she's also a commissioner on the National Commission for Military, National, and Public Service, which is an independent commission within the executive branch that was established in 2017 to conduct a review of the military selective service process. And Sean was previously the director within the Executive Secretariat at the U.S. Department of Transportation. And she also served as a special assistant to the Undersecretary of Defense for Acquisition, Technology, and Logistics at the U.S. Department of Defense. Sean. And I do want to say that collectively, not including me, we have 40 years of naval experience on the stage. Sean was a Navy officer on an active duty for 20 years, and Ambassador Jenkins spent over 20 years in the Naval Reserve. So thank you so much for your service and for being here. So I wanted to get right into it. We've heard a lot about progress that's been made. First, I'd love to hear from you, Ambassador Jenkins, around the challenges that you've seen within the national security and foreign policy space as someone who has spent time in the military, and more recently at the State Department. We know that 22% of the officer corps is made up of people of color, compared to 40% of enlisted folks. We know at the State Department, only 15% of the State Department's staff, or civil service staff, are African American, and only 6% are foreign service officers. So when we talk about the representation of our country around the world, we are failing at that mission. And I'm wondering if you could share more about some of the challenges that you've seen throughout your time in Washington and throughout your service.
Thank you. First of all, thanks for inviting me to be here. This is really a great honor for me to be here. I want to congratulate Atlantic Council for the leadership that you're doing in terms of these issues, and hopefully other think tanks will take heed and do something similar. Congratulations to the Next Gen leaders. I think it's a great program. And so I'm really excited to be here. And in answer to your question, I think there's several things. I mean, one is obviously culture. I think that particularly when you talk about foreign policy and national security issues, there's a lot of old culture that it's very difficult to change. And so it's a culture that perpetuates itself in the sense that people who rise to the top in some of these organizations like State Department very much like to bring other people like themselves. And it's very, very difficult to kind of break that culture, and even with new ideas. Another thing is leadership. Leadership is so important, as all of you know. You have to have leadership from the top to make changes. And I don't think we've seen enough leadership in many foreign policy institutions to really make that change. And so the things that you're seeing, like at Atlantic Council, for example, that's what you call leadership. Because it means, taking a step and saying, we need to make a change and we're going to do it. And so we don't see enough of that. And you also don't see enough of, we heard the word inclusion, that's very important. Sometimes people make cosmetic changes. And they say, we're going to make a little bit of cosmetic change, we're going to check a box, and then we feel like we've done what we need to do. But then it's not really ingrained in the organization, and it's not really ingrained in the culture. And so, as I always tell people, if you're not of the dominant culture, if you're not of the dominant feeling there, you know it, and you can feel it. And if you see people leaving, there's a reason why people leave. It's because they don't feel like they're included. And so it's not something that's just going to be you could do overnight. You have to be committed to it. You have to have your leadership committed to it. You have to understand that culture resists change, and that means taking a bold step and sticking with it, and also making sure that the entire organization is on board. And that often means having plans, revisiting those plans, talking to people, making sure that people feel included in all the different aspects of whether you're talking about government, whether you're talking about the military. You have to understand culture resists change. You need leadership. You need to include those changes throughout the organization. And it has to be real. So.
Thank you. Well, speaking of leaders promulgating change, we also have two founders on stage. And I'm hoping, Sean, we could start with you, and then Ambassador Jenkins, I'd love to go to you as well. Tell me about the origin story of your respective organizations, and in particular, what made you want to take on a mantle of leadership around pushing these new ideas when it is quite challenging? And in addition to what you're doing, I would love to also talk about what we can all do to help, and perhaps we can also get into that in the questions. But Sean, please tell us more. Congratulations.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here on behalf of Out in National Security. Thank you very much to the Atlantic Council for having us here. Right now, I think we're probably a little further along in our lifespan of our little band than we originally might have thought at the start of the year. I've come to appreciate that somewhere you find flying speed on the way towards terminal velocity, and we've kind of been pushed out of the nest by this opportunity. So that's one way to get after it. So the origin, really, with my co-founders Luke Schleuder and Rusty Pickens, it's a conversation that dates back years. That Lucas first started about we're LGBT people in an administration, and in the national security portion of an administration, and we're familiar with the LGBT advocacy world that has meant so much and put a lot of pressure on the administration to do things, to be inclusive. But we felt from looking around that probably trailing in that was national security, that probably we were least represented as an LGBT cohort within the administration, within national security, and in some ways perhaps less deliberatively than the other portions of the administration. As was mentioned, Secretary Fanning, we're everywhere, right? It's just a fact of, I believe, a fact of humanity. LGBT people are found everywhere. A lot of the factors, you recognize them because often it's a factor of privilege and circumstance that allows people to live their authentic lives. It makes them recognizable and it lets them serve as examples and mentors. But we know that folks practice the professions that lend themselves to national security, and oftentimes they don't recognize it, especially when they're LGBTI people. They might not recognize that doctors, lawyers, scientists, environmentalists all have a point to play in national security. If you're a military person, it's kind of self-evident, or if you're a person in the foreign policy domain, it's pretty self-evident. But we've got incredible professionals who are dedicated American patriots who don't realize that their skills might lend themselves to the national security realm, and they're actually desperately needed, and that you can be included as LGBTI people. So the conversation goes back 3 years that Lucas started about there are organizations that work when an administration comes into play as to put people in front of them to consider building out a hopefully diverse administration, and what can we do to start a conversation with the existing LGBT advocacy organizations to go think national security, think non-traditional, what they might think non-traditional professions, and start talking to those folks. They're out there. And then November 2016 happened, which was, we'll all admit, probably unexpected. And then that conversation started to change. Okay, that's not the route to start to have that conversation in, because that door's closed for hopefully only 4 years. So then what can we do? And over the course of the past year and a half, almost 2 years now, well, we're going to need to try and do something. How would we do it? We all wound up with new endeavors to keep our lights on and roofs over our head that kind of took our bandwidth away to pursue it in 2017. And then 2018, we got our conversations further along. Lucas is a master at network building and creating connections. And eventually the connections led us to a place where we started putting more work into it. And then our relationship with the Atlantic Council happened, and we're here. So I know that organizations I've not met, had the pleasure of meeting Ambassador Jenkins before tonight, but I've always thought, since we started thinking about this, that her organization is an exemplar of what we hope to bring to bear for one piece of a conversation in there. In that way, is that it's about being considered exactly the same as everybody else without any different, but then you have to call out the fact that you're not being included to be able to be treated as everybody else. That's why diversity matters. So what we hope to do is we're overwhelmed and really happy by the fact that so many folks have resonated with just our little launch and our initial mission statement, that we just want to provide sort of a locus and a momentum for connectivity. We're out there, we're everywhere, and we actually have, in the national security space, I feel, organizations everywhere. Some of them are very small, pride-centric organizations. There are large organizations, Department of the Army, Department of the Navy, large corporations. They have employee resource groups, all kinds of different groups, but we don't see a professional connectivity between them. Any kind of networking. We don't see, what we see is a nascent basis to create a talent pipeline, to provide those examples, as was stated by the ambassador and by the secretary in that way. And we think if we can use a little, grab a little bit of convening power, we can actuate the power of the entire community that's already out there.
Great, thank you, Ambassador.
First of all, I want to congratulate you on starting the organization. I'm looking forward to working with you and your colleagues. You mentioned the word networking, which is one of the reasons why I wanted to start the organization that I have. Is there was a feeling that there just wasn't a place where there were discussions for women of color on issues of peace and security, including hard security issues. And so there was a desire to be around people who were like themselves and to have a conversation and to develop an understanding of who else was out there doing the work. And I would say there are people doing it, we just don't always see them. When I first started, and some folks know when I first started, I'll date myself, early 90s in the work I was doing, There weren't very many people of color. There were a few women. Fortunately, now there's many more. So from the very beginning, I noticed that there was not very many who looked like me. And so that was another reason why I wanted to start the organization, is to encourage young women to pursue some of these fields of peace and security, and just work on the pipeline, which everyone talks about the pipeline, which is so important. But also to highlight the mid-career women who are working in the field, who no one knows about. You don't see them a lot of times on TV talking. The hidden figures who are out there doing the good work. But also, finally, the institutions. I mean, my goal is to, the pipeline, which is the young women, the mid-career, but the institutions, the culture, the places where that resist the change. And as I said, it's different type of institutions, and so having a focus on that, for example, I like to do programs at institutions that have traditionally been not seen as particularly diverse, and I do that on purpose, so I can show that there is some diversity that can be shown at some of these organizations, so that it can encourage them to do more things like that, and to have conversations with them. So really focusing on those three things to try to develop some more expertise, to develop the pipeline, to have mentorship programs. We have a mentorship program that we started, so that the young girl or even young guy sitting out there in who knows where in the U.S. or overseas, and they feel like they're the only one that's working on this that's like themselves, that they can say, there's other people like me who do this. I don't feel like I'm the only person. I don't feel alone. I don't feel like I'm working up against a hill, and they may be surrounded by family members or friends who discourage them, but they need something to encourage them to want to do that. And so, having a place, having a website where they can look at all these other people like them who are doing it is a way to reach people who you don't even know. Reach people who may be far away from you, who you can bring them into this, and you don't even know that you're doing it, but that's something that you can be doing to help the young people who feel like they need that connection. So, I look at the organizations as doing those things that are what I call the active things, and those things that are the passive things, which are the things that you put on the website so they can feel that they're not alone.
Yeah, thank you. I think sometimes in this very serious town where we tend to rely on PhDs and data and work on very serious issues, sometimes the intangibility of saying, you have to see something to believe you can be it, it can feel a bit fluffy, but it's true that, I think for every one of us in this room, as we built our own careers and in our own passion areas, I mean, I am, as a gay woman of color, I didn't necessarily think about, finding people of color or gay people. I really was just like, what do people that I admire, how did they do that? And I would read their bios, because that was the only way I knew to try and figure out how I could map next steps. And I think being able to provide young people with a roadmap in a way of what you're both doing in terms of a talent pipeline and networking at a certain level. But I wanted to get back to you mentioned mentorship as that third critical component. And so I was curious for both of you, if you could take us back to a pivotal moment in your life and who your mentors were when you were young. And then I want to add a second piece to this. Secretary Fanning talked about young people, right? Learning from 18-year-olds who are joining service for the first time. And I was curious if there are young people that are your role models, or how you think about both learning from those who are more experienced or more expert in a particular area, but also how you think about what you also get back from the young people that I think are going to be flocking to both of you for support and guidance as they map out their journeys. Either one of you can start.
Okay. The core of this is a question that was put to us in preparation for this event, and I really appreciated those because it made me reflect in a way that I hadn't about who my mentors were. I believe the proposed question was as a junior professional. So for me, being a junior professional was being a junior officer. Junior officer flying off aircraft carriers, and I started to think about, and I definitely have recollections of those that I looked up to and that set examples for me. In a profession like the military, but then in a specialty like flying airplanes, senior leaders still have to do a very specific job that's the equal of me as a lieutenant junior grade. The admiral has to know how to fly the jet. The admiral needs to be good in the jet. Even though he's a 2-star admiral, he needs to be able to fly the jet well. and then he's also a titular leader with rank and responsibility. So I really thought about it, and it made me reflect. A word that I didn't really have in my vocabulary, and certainly not in the way I use it today. The ones who I now consider and look back on fondly as the people who showed me the way as to how to be worth something in regard to leading or being responsible for other people, were the people who are actually the most authentic. And what I think about my experience as an out trans woman was that the most empowering thing for me was my embrace of my authenticity, somehow having the privilege and the wherewithal to embrace it, find it, actualize it, but then how that empowered me for when I wound up in the Obama administration and was able, I just put my nose to the grindstone and kept running into the wall every day. But the only way I could do that was by being my most authentic self. The person that I was 10 years before that would not have been able to do that or survive it, frankly, or be as productive as I was. And when I look back at mentors, it's those people who are authentic. They are authentic as aviator leaders. They are authentic as high-ranking people. They are authentic as actual leaders of organizations. And they were the same person through all those roles, and they were the same person, because it was naval aviation, at the bar. But they're also the same people, and many of them, several of them I see to this day at reunion type, semi-annual happy hours and stuff. They're the same people that I saw 25 years ago. And I think it's that power of authenticity. So when you're looking for mentors, it's those people that are going to resonate with you, and more importantly, not just the fact that they're old, not just the fact that they're senior and been there and done that. It's that you're seeing them as a whole authentic person. That's what I really took away from my reflections on that question. And that's what I think is especially important for LGBTI people, is that when they see those people, they're like, I see me or someone like me or someone that's like one of my friends having those responsibilities and those experiences, and it can click for them.
Well, I think I had two. I had role models and mentors who I knew, and some who I didn't know. I mean, I would Harriet Tubman, for example. I look at her, Eleanor Roosevelt, people who are just amazing women. And they give you inspiration, and it's like, wow, just amazing. And then of course there's the mentors who you do know, I've been very fortunate. Most of my mentors were white men. There weren't a lot of people of color in my field, as I said, who I worked with. But I had some great mentors who were very supportive, who I had a lot of fun with. I like to laugh, so I tend to always gravitate to people who are funny and make me laugh, but also are very deep substantively and can also be a sponsor in terms of being able to help me get jobs or recommend me for jobs or say you should talk to this person. So more than just being somebody who I admire and say, and just ask questions to because I have concerns or problems, but somebody who would also sponsor me. And I think that that's something that's very important even today in terms of, finding people who can help. You can have mentors and sponsors. I liked your question about younger people and what they can do, because I think, I always say a mentorship doesn't have to be always the younger person feeling like they have to keep asking the older person and the older person absorbing and or just giving out advice. It's both ways, and I learn a lot from obviously young people. I learn a lot in terms of how they like to do things, how their mind works, what they think about in terms of how they maneuver life based on the experiences that they had when they were growing up, and the world that existed when they were younger and the world that exists now, and looking at how each generation is different and tackles issues differently. I find it interesting to understand that. I also think it helps me when I have to work with younger people who may be working for me to understand what helps them tick. So I learn from them as much as I hope that they learn from me.
TI community, just the language that we should be using, how we should think about certain issues. I find that young people have their finger on the pulse, right? Because they're the ones marching and they have the energy for that kind of thing, whereas I think I just want to write memos and sit quietly and have meetings. But it does feel also in a time of, I think, great political division in the country on certain issues. It's been very interesting to me to see LGBT issues become something that feels like there's a fairly bipartisan consensus, particularly around foreign policy and national security, right? The Atlantic Council just brought the LGBTI advisory group to various agencies across the federal government and heard about progress that was being made. We also have many people in the audience who have done tremendous work under the past administration on this set of issues. And at the time, people were in their mid-20s. I mean, they were fairly young to be executing things that have had trenchant impact over that period of time. And I think that's really exciting. Particularly to Sean, your earlier point around authenticity, and what I heard from you was really effective leadership. And I think cultivating authentic young people who can truly bring the might of their brains and their energies and their passions to the table helps build them into leaders that we need who are interested in public service, who want to continue to serve the country. So I'm curious, in particular, how we can think about, we have the talent pipeline, we have role models and mentors, and then we have the fairly inflexible status of the U.S. government agencies and their logistics and bureaucracy and management. And so I wanted to ask you guys about two things in particular. What could we do to create systemic change? And I want to offer two ideas. The first is the Rooney Rule, which we heard about earlier. The Rooney Rule is something that was put in place with the NFL. And it requires that one person of color be considered for every interview loop to happen, just one. We've seen that be adopted by the Senate and House Dems. I was curious if you think an initiative like that, particularly at the senior levels at which both of you have operated at your respective agencies, would even be possible. And then my second potential idea, but I'm curious what you think, is what access to data looks like. I mean, how do we even begin to offer solutions like a Rooney Rule if we don't even know the status of play, right? A lot of these experiences, and I'm sure that many of us could refer to, feel in a way a bit anecdotal, or the stats are just quite grim, but there aren't very good solutions in terms of how you tactically begin to change that. And so I wanted to present those two ideas or hear from both of you on what you think. So let's start with Rooney Rule. Yes, no, maybe?
I think the Rooney Rule is obviously a start. It's a start, particularly in a situation where something needs to be done and something needs to change. And these things are, like I said, they're good if in fact they can be followed and if they can be sustained and if they can be built upon. So the Rooney Rule is a good start in terms of, okay, we're not seeing, a group of people that we need to see. It's just not happening. So we need to do something. So we need to, and that's something here is saying you have to bring, a diverse, group to me or applicants. It's a start, and something has to change. And so that's one way of at least trying to change the way things are being done and to make people have to think a little bit harder when they do something. So it's easy to say, we don't know a person of a certain group and so therefore we don't have them here. But that's not good enough. It at least makes people think harder about, let's find somebody, a qualified person, because there's qualified people out there. We're not trying hard enough. So it's a start. It's a start. It needs to be built upon. It won't work if nothing happens until you bring people forth and then you see nothing changes. That's the second step. Okay, so to say that there are no qualified people, I don't think that's true. So you have to bring them forward because they at least have to be in the applicant pool, and then you have to really be serious about giving people opportunities and not trying to perpetuate the culture. So it's a step, but whether it will be successful, we have to wait and see. Whether it's possible, I would like to say anything's possible. I think it all depends on who's running it, who's in charge. You have leaders for a reason. You have a leader because a leader's supposed to lead, and that means taking risks, and that means saying, I'm going to do something because I think it's the right thing to do. And if you can't do that, then you shouldn't be a leader. So the question is, are these people going to be leaders and do the right thing? And apparently a lot of them have not been. So it is possible, but you have to have people who want to actually be a leader and do the right thing.
I'll pick up on the ambassador's point. And I was struck, and I'd like to thank Secretary Fanning because setting us up for this question with recounting your time with regard to the Army and your application of it. The commission that I'm on now, but I'm speaking here as an individual, my ethics attorney, I know she's watching. She's always watching. One of the things we were the origin story was around the selective service system and its future, but we have a broader mandate with regard to military, national, and public service, creating an ethos of service, an expectation of service, and reducing barriers to participation in public service in all its forms. And there are many barriers out there. So we've spent a lot of time looking at public service and hiring practices. And one of the things I've come to understand is my appreciation, there are thousands upon thousands of hiring organizations within the federal government. And so when I saw the question with regard to the Rooney Rule, I said, and I listen to sports podcasts as white noise and when I want to go to sleep. So I hear these things by osmosis that was essentially a corporate trust, that to save itself injected this thing, and they only had to do it in 30 instances. And they still kind of watched it break before their eyes in a very public way, and they're trying to tweak it again and make it happen. And then when the Secretary mentioned his thing, he's able to control that and force that in that one instance. But even within, I dare to hazard a guess as to how many different hiring pipelines there are within the Department of the Army. It's got to be thousands upon thousands of places where there are hiring managers and HR shops that do that. So my mind always comes back to the practicality, which I think the ambassador set up, as to you put this policy out there and how do you make it work as much and as fairly as possible in all those instantiations, and what's the right way to do that. We have many of the laws that lead to the policies that we have with public servants and hiring, generally because of abuses or a lack of fairness that led to redress through those matters, and we have to keep continually tweaking that thing, or rebuilding the race car on the track, or however all those analogies go. And in my mind, again, to echo the ambassador's point, it comes back to the leadership. I've had the privilege of sitting in public hearings on the public hiring process. There are real barriers to people participating in their government, and one of them is how do you make what's the whiz-bang new magic silver bullet policy that's going to fix federal hiring? People say we need new authorities, and you find out there are all these different kinds of authorities that are already out there that are being used someplace by somebody. Is there another one hiding someplace? Skelly's personal opinion? No, it's leadership. It's leadership. If you want something to change, do everything in your power with what you've got to make it change. Ask for more help when you need it. That's sort of the military mantra. I'll get it done, but you need to get me these other things while we go after it right now. I think there needs to be a leadership change. The difficulty with federal government is, the top leader is 4 or 8 years at maximum. The subordinate leaders to that executive roll out generally much, much faster than that. And the tension between the political leadership that can advocate and require and demand that change, and then the career civilian leadership that's stuck with the bright ideas that get foisted upon them by the political leadership, that's a real barrier to how to implement those things. And I think there's an element of generational cultural change that has to be done, whereas where I think what organizations such as the Ambassador is, what we hope to do in national security is show through establishing networks and hoping to pull more people in an out manner, or just a present manner, is to make it obvious to folks that you don't have a good slate. If you can do the math, that's where the data comes in. The data is imperative. You have to know what you're looking at to be able to understand it, and then to even try and fix it or make it better. So data is absolutely imperative in that regard, and it has to be deliberative, and it has to be required, I dare say, by Congress. It has to be reportable, not just something that you hold in. It has to be public and transparent, or else it's of no good in that way. But it's initiatives in getting people out and getting them seen so that their value is recognized, and therefore their absence is then recognized in a very stark manner, and that it's unacceptable.
Well, I think Secretary Fanning is a great example of what an empowered leader can do to really reshape an entire organization. So I want to bring up 2020, uncontroversially. I am curious, what would you like to see either the candidates promise, or we've talked about the political appointees, and the process by which political appointees come to the federal government is typically that they are policy advising on the campaigns, which is all relationship driven, right? Who you know, oh, I know somebody who's an expert in this. Let's see if that we can get them to help advise the candidate. And then those people all get appointed to agencies. That process seems to subvert, I think, the systemic change that I've heard results in actual people being in positions of leadership to affect broader change within the federal government. And it also is one that is inherent in DC culture. And I was curious how both of you are thinking about, for your respective organizations, if you are, what we could ask of the 2020 candidates, or once the president is elected, what we could ask of the transition teams in terms of expectations around transparency, of accountability for the demographics of particularly the senior leadership that they're putting into place in your two areas.
Well, I would think they need to start now rather than wait until transition. I think it's important at this point that they are already showing how they are planning on, if they were to win, what is their process and what is their plan for ensuring that the people who they are appointing and who they are surrounding themselves are in fact diverse. That should be part of what they are doing and what they are all the plans that they put together, all the potential policies, all the talking points, all of that. That should be part of what they're doing, so that we see that ahead of time and that we don't wait to see that until the transition. I think it should be reflected in the people who surround them now. I think they should be ensuring that who they are appointing now to work with them should be diverse in all the different aspects of diversity. I think that's important, and I think they should be held accountable even before, way before the elections, because I think that will hopefully, we don't know, but that would hopefully at least be an indication of what we would see. But what is your plan? What is your process? What are you thinking in terms of how you're going to make sure that the people you appoint and the ones who surround you reflect America and reflect the diversity of this country, so that we can hopefully have some confidence that those people who are advising you will be representative of different viewpoints and different backgrounds and different cultures. So we don't have policies that are one-sided or that obviously show that there have not been different people in the room when they were being developed. And they can start that now. They can make sure, because I've never been on a campaign per se, but as I would imagine, as people get closer and closer to being the one that's going to be the Democratic or Republican nominee, you get flooded with a lot of people who want to be working for you. And of course, the ones who have the power and have the money and have the influence will rise to the top. And you have to resist that and say, we're going to have a representative, diverse group of people that I'm going to work with. So it takes doing something that may not be what they normally do. It just means, once again, taking time to think through it.
Questions ready, because I'll turn to you after this, but perhaps I'll leave us with one quick thought. What's one action that everyone in this audience can take for each of you in order to support this set of issues, to amplify some of the recommendations that you all have had, or take any other action if people are interested and eager to continue progress in this regard?
I always think there's strength in numbers. So, I'm very happy to hear about, your new organization, because I think there are certainly ways to work together to promote some of our goals, to make sure that we all are ensuring that national security foreign policy is diverse in its makeup and in its final decision, in the process of decision making, that we, continue to think through what we can be doing for 2020. But I think working together, planning together is, as I say, strength in numbers.
My thoughts go to mentorship. Probably everybody who is in this room is either deliberately or unknowingly served as a mentor. And if you're doing it consciously, I'd say I've been reading some stuff, and if you read the Harvard Business Review, you're that much smarter, right? But a lot of stuff about diversity. I think that the Ambassadors Organization tweets out quite a bit. that I think are really fascinating. But my mind has been open because I had people refer to me as their mentor, and I said I did not know that that was what we were doing. It's probably made it go all the better, you know. But the vitality of mentoring people that don't look exactly like you, when you can, whether that be the young woman who referred to me as a mentor and shocked me, stopped me in my place, is an incredibly wonderful person who's the future of the intelligence community, who's could not be more Midwestern, straight out of central casting, and I still laugh every time she refers to a Coke as a pop. So she and I on the sort of diversity chart are somewhere polar, right, in some axis. But that has nothing to do with our relationship. It's that we like each other and we have experiences to share with each other in that way. And I think it's that kind of outreach. And of course I talk to younger trans folks too. But I think it's that broaden your perspective deliberately when you can, as you can. And don't just mentor people, but I'm coming to appreciate that there's also sponsorship. Identify people who have talent that are different and push them for that reason. If they're qualified, help move them along. So I think it's just for all of us to expand our apertures as to who we help along in our journeys, because that makes us all the better. Because I know I just had cause to reflect on it a short time ago. The most moving aspect of my 3 years in the Obama administration was anytime I'd walk into an administration kind of wide representative meeting, if it wasn't necessarily one in the Pentagon, but it was something going on at the White House or the EEOB where there was a slice of folks from across the administration of all strata. And I would just get stopped in my virtual or real tracks and go, oh my gosh, I'm in a room that is America every time. And it brings me to a slight tear when I see the photos of that place today. But that's what our job is to ensure that we that the people that serve America need to look like America in all its forms. And that's when they're going to be best served. And when we all work towards that, which I think is what we're talking about, that's perhaps the best goal.
Yeah, that's great. Well, I'm excited to send young people to both of your organizations, because I think the time and the rigor that you're placing behind your work is incredibly impressive. Questions from the audience? We will start here, please. And we have roving mics in the back, so just raise your hand.
Hi. Thank you for sharing your experiences. This has been very enlightening and inspiring and all those other words. So my question is kind of on the other end. As a young, quote-unquote, diverse person in a not diverse institution, what can junior people do to sort of push that needle? And also kind of more specifically, a lot of these institutions see diversity as a checkbox, where if someone fits one of those diverse demographics, whatever that may be, then that's it. Great, we're diverse. And that's pretty much it, whereas obviously we know there's much more nuance to that. How can we add that nuance to conversations at our institutions? Thank you.
Well, as young people, you have power. And one of the things I always think about is finding allies. You're starting out by finding allies and others who share some of your thoughts and passions and what you want to achieve. And then, you know, you have conversations with your supervisor, you have conversations with others in the leadership. You know, just kind of having these kind of conversations and raising some of your concerns in a conversational way. It doesn't have to be a confrontation. But, you know, saying, we'd like to say you wanted to have different kind of programs, or say you want to, some people talk about starting mentorship programs would be helpful, or just having conversations about, it'd be great to think about how we can, make it more diverse. I know some organizations have different types of programs to bring in young people, next gen people, just have these kind of conversations. I had one young person approach me and say, my board that I work at an organization, my board has no diversity. We want to recommend that they talk to you to be on the board, I was never actually approached that way to be on a board, but I thought was really, I felt really proud of them that they agreed to take it upon themselves to approach the board and raise the fact that there's no diversity. And they were going to do it as a group, and not like I said, not a confrontation, but just say, this is something that's really important to us, and we recognize that it doesn't exist, and we think it really does need to be something that we think will enrich the organization. So I was, I thought that's pretty good that that they felt confident and ready to do that. So it really, for me, it's, finding others who share some of your thoughts, and then, finding a way to approach and talk about some of these issues.
It would tell you a lot about an organization that you're a part of if you can't find someone to want to talk with. It took me very late in life to understand how willing people are to help other people for the right reasons, and that when you go and talk to someone, they should help you. And if you're in an organization where you can't find someone a little bit more senior than you or a lot more senior than you, it'll say a lot about the character of that organization, that they're responsive to you as an individual, and that they value organizations that aren't willing to develop the people in them are not healthy organizations that hopefully don't last too long in that way. The ambassador's comment about diversity in boards just made me reflect about the ongoing trend of states starting to mandate that corporate boards that are incorporated in their state have to have a set percentage of women on their board. And I haven't heard anybody decry the end of freedom for that yet. But the fact that that occurs on the basis of corporate health, which is about profits and the economy, should prove that such an approach to demanding and requiring diversity for the right reasons, because those organizations are by definition smarter and more functional and more effective, or else they wouldn't do it in an organization that's about profit. And that applies to things like national security and government as well. Government exists to serve and to perform. And if we know that diversity makes those organizations better, then we should be incorporating it for the right reasons and making it really happen.
And just one more point about being alone. I mean, the point about allies is really important, and using things as a teaching moment. So, for example, if you're the only person of color, LGBTI, whatever the case may be, the only person from Wyoming, but the thing is, finding allies it's also a teaching moment. It's an opportunity to reach out to others and talk about some of these issues, and finding who would support you on some of these things, because it's important to have people who don't look like yourself who are supportive of your work and supportive of these issues, because these are going to be the people you're going to be working with, as you mature and you rise up in your organization or whatever organization to leadership. So you want to have people who look like you or who are like you, but others who are not look like you or are like you, because you want them as allies. So, teaching moments.
I also do think there's a paradox that when you're young in this town, it's very hard to figure out how you can contribute. And when you are a diverse slice, whatever kind of diversity you bring to the table, it can feel like that maybe is what you are able to bring to the table, and that's true. But then I think being able to balance it because inherently when you are identified as just who you are, exclusive of whatever your brain is passionate about, or whether your work is targeted on nuclear nonproliferation or whatever other areas, right, it can be narrowing. And so I think being able to call upon allies who can amplify and uplift you, especially more senior ones, to be able to make sure that the full width and breadth of your talents are being recognized, and being able to tactically use things that you know, and you know better than everyone else around the table. And that's hard, but I think you can do it. Next question. Please, we'll start with Jesse, and then we'll move over to the other two.
Hi. So I just have to say it's such a great sign, I think, to see a mainstream think tank such as the Atlantic Council take on LGBT issues. And so I really want to thank the leadership of everyone here, and Mira, of course, and Damien. I think, one risk, though, that kind of comes with this is, the siloing of LGBT issues. And I think, this is a question and a comment, how do we actually make sure that these issues are integrated into foreign policy? And I think one of the things I found is there's so many regional foreign policy initiatives in the Caribbean Basin Initiative, that's lasted amongst different administrations. There's the Indo-Pacific strategy, both Obama administration, this current administration, has a strategy for the Indo-Pacific. When I've talked to people who work on the Caribbean or in Asia Pacific, and I tell them, that like all these countries criminalize LGBT status, they have no idea. So I guess, the question is, how do we integrate LGBT rights and build awareness within the foreign policy community, particularly in, initiatives on Africa or the Middle East, to kind of raise awareness and make sure that, when we're thinking about police training or law enforcement, that we're taking into account these issues. So thank you.
Yeah. I'll just share a quick experience from our time at the State Department. I think the only reason we were able to make as much progress as we did on LGBTI rights, from the Global Equality Fund to policy changes at a regional and country level, was because we had such strong leadership around women's issues. And that there was a women's fund that was created, which freed up a lot of the angst of lawyers. And so I think being able to, at least at State at that time, help align LGBT issues as something that followed in the footsteps of another movement that was seen as non-controversial to an extent, or at least not as controversial as LGBT rights was at the time in 2010. That was very helpful, I think, for advancing our work. But I also think that was dependent on what our leadership thought was most important. And Hillary Clinton at the time was, women's rights are human rights. And so to be able to associate in a way with that mantra, and obviously the overlapping issues shared around women's rights and LGBTI rights, was incredibly helpful. However, I do think that there is a trade-off in terms of the diversity within our community and whether all those lessons are cleanly applicable when you're thinking about gender or women's rights in particular, and how those manifest at a regional or country level.
I'd offer that's one of the reasons why it's imperative for us to be in as many rooms as we should be in, being representative, or our place in organizations like national security being adequately representative of our population within the country that's being represented in there. The government, the American government, is supposed to be working on behalf of the American people and the values that we hold. And how comfortable are we as Americans, LGBTI Americans? How comfortable are we as LGBTI government employees or appointees, whatever the role may be, when the government's not valuing those things in what it espouses and what it works for overseas? I think that's why we have to be in those rooms for that point, and to be the accomplished professionals that we are, to be able to add that voice at the opportune moment, the right moment, whether it be before the decision or way down in the formulation process, in that way on how I don't feel good about this. That point, I think that's a part of it. It's not all of it, but I think your point is very well taken as to how do we do those things. And perhaps some of those things happen because we're not present enough.
We have two questions over here. For, I think it was you in the glasses and the gentleman next to you, I believe, and then we'll keep going. Oh, well, you two can fight it out. I'm just kidding. It's
Hi,
fine.
I
We're
just
all
had
friends here.
mine's pretty brief. So my question was primarily about navigating going from being a civil servant to joining the administration as an appointee.
Mm-hmm.
This is my first, I was in the Army for a while, and then I joined the Treasury Department. So this is my first civil service job, but my goal is to go into an appointed position in the next Democratic administration. Mm-hmm. How would you what advice would you offer to doing that? And that's my question.
Sure.
I guess I'll answer that. It's interesting because I don't know if there's always a specific path. So obviously, there's several ways people are political appointees. One is, you give tons of money, and so that's one way that you get a lot of folks. But the other way is being attached to a campaign. And so now if you're working in the government at the time, there are limitations to how much you can do, which is an inherent problem in terms of how much you can really be a part of a campaign because of those limitations. But getting out there and letting people have to know who you are. People have to know you exist. And that's the best way, is to have your name come up, in conversations. And the way to make sure that happens is to be present in some way, in things that are going on prior to the administration. In my case, for example, the reason I don't know how my name was mentioned, but the reason I think it was is because I was working on I used to work at the Ford Foundation, and I used to do programs with a lot of people who worked in DC because I had a lot of grantees in DC. And I think my name just kind of got floated around that way. So, that's why I say there's no one way of doing it, because I wasn't really, I was in New York, and I wasn't really doing a lot at that time because I was traveling and doing other things. But people knew who I was. And so, so it's either give tons of money, or just make sure people know who you are. And then there's different ways you can do that. There's different ways that people can know who you are in terms of, and of course, what you're interested in. And that can be one way that you're getting involved. That's just my advice. I'm sure there's lots of other advice that people can do on that.
Study up on the Hatch Act. Know your limits. Yeah. Buy a pair of comfortable walking shoes. Save up your leave and be ready to knock doors. And then network the heck out with the people you can find that are attached to campaigns.
Yeah. And I would look up, I think, particularly from 2000, within the Obama administration, all of these organizations popped up to tackle the issue you're talking about, which is how do we build a pipeline around political appointments that represent the diversity of America. And so the Victory Fund has the Victory Institute. They have a presidential appointments project there. I would also think about, the Atlantic Council has the Millennium Fellowship, right? There are these Council on Foreign Relations as a term member program. There are things for young people that identify you as someone who's passionate and interested in a leader in your own way around foreign policy and national security. And I think being able to fully own who you are in those roles, because you're smart, you're talented, you wouldn't have gotten the roles that you've gotten if you weren't. And I think being able to use those sorts of platforms to be able to also amplify your name and your work to senior people who really don't have a lot of time but really have needs that they want to be fulfilled is helpful. But I would look at Victory in particular for any LGBTI folks who are interested in getting appointed, because it was a nonpartisan appointment process. I'm not sure if they're doing it again, but I think that's one particularly interesting avenue.
Hi, Jason Coleman, State Department. Just a statement and then a question. I think a huge portion of what we're missing is, why do people want to join the government? It's great when they get in and then you can initiate these diversity things, but after surviving, 6 shutdowns now in my federal career, the public perception of federal employees is at an all-time low. So you're coming out of college, you have debt, why do you want to join the federal government as a GS5 to work your way up to a 15 after 20 years? So I think that's a huge thing that the government neither works on to attract talent. You don't see government commercials like you see Army commercials. So I think that's a huge thing that is missing, especially from the talent pool where I work, and I still have 3 positions that I haven't been able to hire for 2.5 years because we had a freeze. So it's something that I think that it's not going to change until you change the perception of what a government civilian worker is. And then my next question, just to parry off that, is then how do you make government cool? Why would someone pick that as their first choice instead of going to a Booz Allen or a KPMG or to the private sector to make $250,000? And I have seen tons of talent come out of the government to places like Facebook and to places like going to Amazon. When Amazon comes, there's going to be a flow of government workers with experience to go and make money, where they're going to be seen as someone and not just a disposable person when people on the Hill can't make policy correctly. So I guess that's just my 2 cents on that. So,
Sean, please.
I've been a person, and thanks for those questions and comments. It seems to be somewhat cyclical sometimes. You have people like myself. I always wanted to work for the government. I don't remember a time I didn't. When I was young, I don't know where it came from. I don't know where what they call the desire for public service came from. So I was going to work in the government because that's what I wanted to do. And I started working in New York City government. Then I worked in New York State government. I went up to Albany, New York, and then I came straight to Washington, D.C. That's all what I wanted to do. And so you're always going to have people most people in the government who stay are there because they have the calling for public service. And so they will deal with the ups and downs because that's what they want to do. And so you will always fortunately have influx of people who are there for that reason. But it's also the result of, right now it's just a bad time, because you have an environment and I don't want to get political, but you have an administration which doesn't seem to have a lot of positive feelings about the government. And so that permeates a lot of what happened. And when you saw when Obama was elected, there was a huge influx of young people into the government because they were excited, they wanted to make change, you're energized, and that's kind of flipped now. And so I have a lot of young people who say, I want to work for the State Department, I want to work for USAID, but I don't want to go into government right now. I want to wait. And they're really trying to figure out what to do. They're like, but I always wanted to do this, and I graduated, and I'm here, and I want to work in the government, but they just don't want to go in right now. And so they're hoping that maybe things will change, and I'm just being honest. They're hoping things will change, and then they'll go in. So I think it's obviously the situation, the environment can be cyclical, and there will always be the great jobs that are out there. That you will always lose some people because, people just change jobs anyway at some point. Fortunately, some will stay in, but that will always be a part of it. You'll always have the Facebooks, the Googles, or whoever that will offer something and more money. But that happens. But fortunately, traditionally, we've had a lot of people who stayed in government who stuck it out because that's what they really wanted to do. So I don't know if that's really an answer. It's more of a response. That's not necessarily a particular answer to that situation. But that's kind of what I've observed, having worked in government for many years, and having stayed in government, and knowing that I'm sacrificing money by being in government. That just kind of goes to the territory. You're not going to get rich, doing it. But it's a sacrifice I was willing to take because I like public service. So it's more of that's just a comment, not necessarily a total answer, but those are some of the things I observed. I don't know if you.
So to your point, this is where I can talk about what I'm doing or what my commission is doing. The National Commission on Military National Public Service, inspiretoserve.gov, please. One of the things we're looking at with regard to public services you talked about, it's not especially well thought of in the public domain. Some of that is the government's own fault. You mentioned the Army example. You see Army ads all the time. The Army has an incredibly high demand for people that it needs to hire every year. All the military service does. It's the nature of the beast in terms of the demographics that they need to ingest every year because of the mission sets and the job responsibilities. You can't keep being an infantryman forever, type of thing, like you can in other professions. I was just shocked just the other day, don't my nails look great, in my nail salon, see an ad for the FBI agents on the thing. I'm like, where the heck did that come from in that way, right? That's a change. And then I actually saw it someplace in an article that the FBI is actually out there pushing out because it's a leadership decision to find the money and spend the money, not just to recruit, but I think where the point you're making is educate. We don't educate the average American as to what their government does, what they should expect from their government, and how they can hold their government responsible by voting. I find as an American the most embarrassing thing about our country is our voter participation rate. And I just look at what they go through in India to extend the vote to one person out in the middle of the jungle, and there's 5 people trucking with chopping down vines to bring a ballot box to a person so they can vote. It starts way from my unfortunate decade working in improvised explosive device defeat. It's left of boom. The further you get away from the problem at the beginning of the chain, the more impact you can have with a disproportionately less amount of resource. It's education. Some of what my commission's recommending is likely to recommend, we're pre-decisional, is increased civics education and increase service education with a healthy dose of government in there. Not just that there are the 3 branches, but the fact that your local county and state governments are there for you too, and what they do, and that you can have a career working for your county. Fairfax County is bigger than some states. Same for Montgomery County. There are lots of jobs in there. You can live a life and support a family and have a really healthy and vibrant career working for your local county or city or your state, let alone the federal government in that way. And then you have to go out, and if you educate those people, then you have a better chance of recruiting them. And the government spends almost nothing on recruiting. Some very small, discrete agencies do, because they have such hyper-technical specific needs that they need to bag just a van full of people every year to keep their organization going, and that doesn't work for the entirety of like HHS. But they need some highly qualified specialists that they go out and manage to find some of in that way, because they use discrete authorities. I think it's really about getting left of the problem and educating folks and holding us responsible to our, if you know what your government's supposed to do for you, then maybe you want to go and get in there and make it do what it's supposed to do. For me, I don't hold myself up as like jets and aircraft carriers. Yes, please, you know, kind of thing. And somehow it worked out. I mean, it's just a part of a roll of the dice in that way. But I think there's a lot of early education, public school education, state curricula that goes into that can set the conditions to move the needle on respect for government employees. I had the opportunity to go on a visit to the Denver, essentially federal campus, where several agencies have their regional headquarters, talk with a bunch of Department of Interior folks. Many of them were back office kind of financial type people, what people look at as administrative folks. And a woman talked about why she liked working in federal government by explaining how she was very proud of the work she did ensuring that travel claims were filled for the firefighters who swarmed to the western brush fires of nearly 2 years ago, and how she felt connection to that mission as a person who processed travel claims. And I swelled with pride. I got a little misty-eyed, because that's exactly what we worked to do in the Navy. When I was an administrative department head in a jet squadron, where I wanted to make sure that my kids that were down in the bowels of the carrier, that could barely hear the jets up above that we were flying, that was the mission of the whole thing, that they felt a connection to their fellow squadron mates who were up on the roof, on the flight deck, launching jets, because launching the jets is more dangerous than flying the jets up there, and that they all felt part of that same team. So when this woman, who was a travel clerk, feels connected to those, smoke jumpers and firefighters, that's government at its best. Do the American people hear that in a deliberate fashion? No. That's a failure. Those are the things we need to address.
And the other thing is, just to pick up on that, I know that I think the outreach is really important, because I know that I've done been asked to go and speak about government service. And I know we have like diplomats and residents in different parts of the U.S., and I think that's what they're supposed to do as well. So I think this going out and educating, I mean, I always remember when I was young, I went to something and there were these, you talk about the FBI, there were these FBI agents recruiting people, and I was always like, that's really kind of cool. This is very early in my career, or childhood. So that does help, seeing these role models and these people earlier, you do get a sense of what they're doing and impressed by it. So,
Thank you.
Yeah.
So much. Please join me in thanking these two women for their service, their leadership for our country, and to the Atlanta Council. Thank you so much for having this event. And you heard them, gays, get ready to recruit the children of America. Please join us for a celebration outside to celebrate Pride and also to celebrate the Atlanta Council and all of its work on LGBTI rights. Thank you.